All right. Well, again, welcome. My name is Dave Davis, and I'm on the Telos team. And today I'm speaking to you from Chicago, Illinois, where it is still not spring-like at all. But for those of you that are joining us at a Telos event for the first time, the Telos Group is an American not-for-profit based in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to form communities of peacemakers across lines of difference and equip them to help reconcile seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. It is no small task, but it is a shared burden, and it is shared by people like you who have come alongside and who have welcomed these conversations. And today we're going to discuss a topic that is near to me. We're going to dive into the understanding of evangelicalism. We'll take a look at its historical perspective, its current context, and briefly touch on the impact that it has had on American politics, and we'll look ahead to where the future of evangelicalism may lie. And I'm joined today by two experts in the field, Dr. Samuel Perry and Professor Dr. Marcia Pally. Dr. Samuel Perry is a sociologist, he's a scholar, a professor at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Perry is among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity and American politics, race, sexuality, and families, along with a ton of articles in leading academic journals. Dr. Perry has also authored or co-authored 4 books, including one that's about to be released called The Flag and the Cross. And Dr. Marcia Pally is a professor at New York University, at Fordham, and is a guest professor at Humboldt University. She also teaches in Germany. Her research interests are culture, religion, politics, as well as the intersection of culture and language. Dr. Pally is the author of several books, and a new one that is that is about to be released that we're going to be discussing today, called the white evangelicals and right-wing populism. This new book and its concepts contained really are going to be the bulk of what we'll chat about today. So Dr. Perry and Dr. Pally, welcome, and thank you for your time today. And before we get started, I want to let our viewers know that we will reserve some time at the end for your questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat box there in Zoom to list those, and we'll go through those, and we'll have some time at the end to answer those. But again, thank you. So let's dive in. Let's get started. So Professor Pally, tell us a little bit about how we got here as evangelicals. What has led to this moment in time for the evangelical community?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody at Telos for making this this conversation possible, and to you, Dave, and to you, Sam, for joining, and to all of you here. And we kind of agreed that I would begin with a short introduction that would pull out some of the themes of the new book, White Evangelicals and Right-Wing Populism. And here comes the important point: how did we get here? The point of the writing of the book was to understand the history, the political history, the religious beliefs, and the present circumstances, both religious and non-religious, that led us to our present politics. It's research, it's an inquiry, and most of all, it's an attempt to understand. So I'm going to begin with my 10-minute or so overview, and then we'll plunge into conversation. So here goes. Evangelicals, while declining as a percentage of the population, comprise 25% of all US voters. White evangelical support for Donald Trump rose from 81% in 2016 to 84% in 2020. Why? Especially since much of Trump-style populism violates the Christian ethics of aiding the least of these and of hospitality. I take the long view in answering this question because we can't address our present politics without understanding its foundations. And that's why I subtitled it, How Did We Get Here? What's the story of how white evangelicals, or many, if not all, white evangelicals have gotten to their present politics? I'm also going to take the broad view because white evangelical politics emerges partly from religious concerns and partly from an array of socioeconomic and political ones, like everybody else's politics. In fact, in the 2016 presidential election, the factors most important in determining evangelical choice of candidate were the economy and national security. Abortion was most important for half as many evangelicals, LGBTQ matters for a quarter. In 2020, the economy was again the highest priority, followed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we may ask, what in evangelical political and religious history, theology, and present conditions makes right-wing populism seem like the ethical stance to deeply religious and considered people? So let's start with the definition of populism as a response to an array of duresses, way of life duress, status loss, economic duress, that finds solution in us-them frameworks. And these frameworks draw in complex ways from historical and cultural notions of society, who's us, who's them, who's in, who's not, and of government, its proper size and role. Local traditions are key in determining us and them today and historically. For instance, you hear a good deal about a them of Mexican migrants in the US and hardly a peep about the Roma. There are no cultural, historical receptors, so to speak, for anti-Roma sentiment in the United States. We can follow how each part, duress, us-them shift, and cultural resources plays out among white evangelicals. Many of the duressors are like those confronting other Americans, concerns that economic horizons are dimming in a rapidly changing economy, plus changes in gender roles, technology, demographics, or fear of losing one's place in society is also key. Those most attracted to the Republican Party and the political right between 2010 and 18 were white, high school only middle income earners concerned that their place in the middle class was under threat. In addition to these stressors are those bearing specifically on white evangelicals, including membership loss, concern about cultural marginalization, and fear of religious life being trounced by a secular government in an increasingly secular society. Think evangelical bakers and gay weddings. White evangelicals are America's most aged religious group with a median age of 56. More than 2 million left the Southern Baptist Convention since 2006. So we have American and specifically evangelical duresses. Now, a funny thing happens under duress, what we're calling us-them shift. Psychologically and emotionally, the usual focus on one's own group shifts self-protectively to constraining an other thought to be the source of the duress. That is, to us-them thinking. Separating oneself from the other is a defense mechanism of first resort to protect oneself from repeated vulnerability. Psychiatrist Vamek Volkan writes, the more stressful the situation, the more neighbor groups become preoccupied with each other. But which neighbor to become preoccupied with? That begins with historical, cultural notions of society, who's us, who's them, who's in, who's out, and government, its size and role. Notions of us, them feel right precisely because they are familiar and rooted in our respected past. A lot has gone into America's idea about society and government. The earliest piece was covenantal political theology brought over by the Puritans and other freethinkers who didn't conform to Europe's state churches. Covenantalists saw society as a covenant among persons and with God. If a ruler violated covenant with the people, he could be removed from office. Covenantal political theory was wary of princes, church authorities, and outsiders who could muddy up the covenant and way of life. Aristotelian republicanism also emphasizes community, the polis, and citizen participation in running it. It too is wary of tyrants. Liberalism puts greater stress on individual freedom to leave community, but is equally wary of authorities. Think Alexander Hamilton, who thought of freedom as a means to personal advancement and protection from government regulation. Wariness of government was especially persuasive in America, as many immigrants had fled oppressive political systems. And the harsh frontier too advised self-reliance, trust in one's local community, and caution about authorities and outsiders. Evangelicals in America, as Americans, are heirs of this history and contributed to it. As covenantalists, their ancestors also left Europe with a strong sense of community responsibility. As Europe's persecuted minorities, they arrived with the dissenters' wariness of government and outsiders. They also held to two key doctrines: the fallenness of human government and personal responsibility to come to truth about God and world rather than follow priestly authority. As all governments are imperfect and may not be taken for the kingdom of God, each individual must work out her own moral reckoning, a belief that again encouraged wariness of authorities and outsiders. You might say evangelicals had not only a political grounding in government and outsider wariness, but also a doctrinal one. With this double caution, evangelicals became prime builders of America's self-reliant ethos and republic. The largest government office in America before the Civil War was the Postal Service. By 1850, evangelical churches had double the employees, twice as many facilities, and raised 3 times as much money for their local projects. The turn of the 20th century, however, saw changes in the societal place of white evangelicals, beginning with industrialization, urbanization, Darwinism, and by the new highly scholarly historical critical school of biblical exegesis, which threatened to unseat America's grassroots, democratic, but untutored understanding of the Bible. So in both religious and secular arenas, white evangelicals who in the 19th century had been at the forefront of much American culture and development found themselves in a rearguard position. In the 20th century, evangelicals lost the 1925 Scopes Supreme Court case permitting teaching evolution in the public schools. In 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that school-led prayer was unconstitutional. Then came the 60s sexual revolution, the feminist and gay rights movements. In 1973, abortion was legalized. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled gay marriage a constitutional right. Today, 79% of Americans and 65% of Republicans support anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, furthering evangelical fears of a drubbing by a secular state and society. Under accumulating stresses, we find us-them shift. The heritage of community may become a self-protective, my community in struggle against outsiders. Traditionally in America, new immigrants, minorities, seen as radically other since the colonial era. Wariness of oppressive governments or elites may become suspicion of governments or elites per se, of all government and elites, whose activities should thus be limited, except to constrain outsiders. The walloping paradox of populism is that the very anti-authoritarianism and community building that contributed much to American vibrancy and that are bequeathed to evangelicals by history and doctrine as the ethical life may, under distress, torque or turn to exclusionary us-them defense. Starting in the 1970s, this energy was channeled to the new right, which promoted small governmentism, restrictions on government regulations, religio-moral conservatism, resistance to outsider disruptions of local ways, and an anti-communist foreign policy to defeat the biggest of big atheist Soviet governments. Understanding this is the ethical path white evangelicals have given majorities to Republican candidates In presidential races from 1980, a low of 62% in 1996, and to a high of 84% in 2020. 2/3 voted for Ronald Reagan, whose priorities were reduction of government through tax cuts and business deregulation, plus exhausting the Soviet Union by outspending it on arms. In 2000, 79% of evangelicals voted for George W. Bush, whose major domestic achievements were, again, tax cuts and business deregulation. This is not an anti-abortion vote that gets Republican small governmentism as a tag-along. It's a small government political and economic stance deriving from the history we've just reviewed. Making Bush's tax cuts permanent was a legislative priority for the Christian Coalition. Evangelical support for George W. Bush rose 10 points between 2000 and his re-election in 2004, without any national legislation limiting abortion, even when the Republicans controlled the presidency and Congress. This does not suggest that evangelicals were pleased with this inactivity about abortion, but that they were sufficiently satisfied with Bush's economic and political policies to substantially increase support. Government and outsider wariness sharpened with the 21st century economic and status and way of life anxieties, and more so with the election of the country's first African-American president. Obama not only increased the presence of people of color in positions of authority, but he expanded business regulation and the role of government in social services, healthcare, and environmental protection. Evangelical radio host Eric Metaxas responded with traditional animus towards our traditional thems, Washington and outsiders, laced with Christianized white supremacy. Quote, Beltway, meaning Washington, D.C., and Manhattan elites, he said, perpetrate a new and accepted tribalism and xenophobia upon white European Christian varieties of people. This is not the voice of all white evangelicals. Critique of outsider animus and of racism has become robust since the 1995 apology by the Southern Baptist Convention, quote, to all African Americans for condoning and or perpetuating individual and systemic racism, close quote. In 2010, the National Association of Evangelicals and the Southern Baptist Convention, among other evangelical organizations, called for comprehensive immigration reform, including a path to citizenship for undocumented residents. And just this month, the National Association of Evangelicals hired Mekdes Hadis, an Ethiopian immigrant woman, to head its new Racial Justice and Reconciliation Collaborative, which provides resources and trainings for churches. A significant minority of white evangelicals, like those in Christians Against Christian Nationalism, opposes the political right altogether. But it's been an uneven reckoning. The link between outsider animus racist views and white Christian self-identification is strongest among faith groups that have historically been dominant. Evangelicals in the South, Catholics in the Northeast. These findings from the Public Religion Research Institute suggest that formerly dominant groups, those most suffering status and other losses, may turn most to us-them frameworks. In 2021, 75% of white evangelicals held that Islam is at odds with American values, 20 points higher than any other religious group. 66% thought of newcomers as invaders. 57% preferred living in a country where most people are Christian. No other religious group comes within 20 points of this majority. When Trump first ran for president, white evangelical government and outsider wariness was not new. It goes back to the colonial era, but it was enlivened by him and others who tapped into and reinforced suspicion of America's traditional thems, the deep state, the Washington, D.C. swamp, and its fake news elite media, Mexican rapists, Muslim terrorists, and protectionist trade policies that punish foreigners who cheat. Trump cut taxes, social services, business regulation, and environmental protection, all as government overreach. White evangelicals triage and balance concerns about government and outsiders with religious issues, with Trump also appeal to, with, for instance, photos of him holding a Bible. When he moved the US Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he said, "That's for the evangelicals." Researchers Sidus Tesler and Bavrick call Trump's tactics of fanning people's anxieties for personal power, hunting where the ducks are. Other populist leaders now follow his technique, use people's anxieties to animate fear of long-standing thems, government and outsiders, and then promise protection. Will the promised protection relieve the original duress? While the shift to us-them thinking is a common emotional response to fear and is easily enlivened, it is also a tragic response. The solutions found in us-them shift are based on the distortions that duress itself prods, from community to exclusion, and from wariness of oppression to wariness of government. Based on distortions, solutions emerging from us-them thinking cannot address the sources of duress. With such proposals born of us-them distortion, the original duresses remain to the harm of the very distressed communities and to prod further rounds of us-them anger. The ones to benefit are those who rise to power by stoking duress and anxiety and not relieving it. Thank you very much for your time. I'm eager to hear what the others have to say.
Yeah, thank you. That was a lengthy overview of where we are headed today. And so I'm curious, you named several terms in there: populism, duress. First, I'd like you to clarify those terms for those might be less familiar to those terms as it relates to your work. But I wonder, Dr. Perry, if you could also just give us some context from what you just heard and how that relates to your own research and your own study of where evangelicals are today, where they've landed today, and sort of their end game.
Well, first, I just want to say that was a brilliant overview, and I appreciated all of that. That was, just actually a lot of fun to see those things tied together, and I think in a very coherent and comprehensive way. And so I applaud Dr. Pally's just synthesis of all of that research and integrating it together. And I just think that's just a really powerful narrative. I think a couple of things that we would document, or at least I would add to the narrative, is that oftentimes this thread extends, this thread of say like authoritarian populism that is characterized by conspiratorial thinking and support for strongman leadership, especially post-Obama that we're seeing right now. And I think that is more vocal and outspoken and just out there. I think one, we can demonstrate that actually is transcending evangelicals now, right? Like, so that is not just a white evangelical story, even though granted, white evangelicals carry this ideology and characterization further. We talk about white Christian nationalism being this, both the deep story of America's past, being wedded to Christian principles, the Bible, Christian identity and character, but also a vision of what America could and should be, both in God's eyes and in light of like what will make us prosperous and successful and rescue us back from the brink of the other and big government and all of the things that are supposedly corrupting society. So that extends beyond white evangelicals now. It actually, in fact, we see it characterized in many conservative white Catholics, white mainline Protestants, and even some white seculars. This is actually one of the, I think, more fascinating developments. Over the past few decades, what we have seen, and sometimes I show little charts on this, but what we have seen is we have seen a political, racial, and religious realignment in the United States to where, you know, in the 1970s and early 1980s, you were just as likely to be an evangelical Democrat as a Republican. Statistically, they were right next to each other in terms of percentage of evangelicals within those parties. But within the past few decades, obviously, evangelicals have swept into the Republican Party. Republican Party has been characterized by greater ideological purity. That is kicking out the moderates and the liberals, or them leaving. And meanwhile, the Democrats are characterized by all this ideological and religious diversity and racial diversity. Republicans are moving towards greater ideological, religious, and racial purity. So that being the case, if you find yourself aligned with just Republican conservatism within the past few decades, whether you are evangelical by identity or not, even secular, Catholic, mainline, you can find yourself really embracing a lot of the ideological characteristics that Dr. Pally was talking about, that kind of conspiratorial, authoritarian, anti-democratic populism, what she talks about. So I would say that is one thing I would just add on to that. Another thing is I think a lot of this is corresponding to the rise of social media, and I don't want to be alarmist about social media and all of the ills and horrible things. John Haidt, who I appreciate, just came out with an article in The Atlantic I think this past week, talking about how social media has made us dumber and is just wrecking our political discourse. And in some ways, I mean, I think that is true, but taking more of an agnostic to the good or bad overall contributions of social media, I think you can say it certainly does highlight and obscure the middle. In other words, like what you see on social media is you see angry people on the left and the right, and it gives the impression that is all of Americans, and we're so polarized and so divided, and we forget that there is a lot of Americans who are just disengaged politically, or they're in the moderate, or in that kind of like large mega moderate group that really isn't activated politically. They're not angry. If they're on social media, they're just kind of watching the show, and you know, they could be co-opted, they could be manipulated, they could be convinced to get activated into certain kind of agendas and rhetoric. But for the most part, like most Americans, are not ideologues, and they're not co-opted like minions in this game yet. So I think social media can obscure and give the impression that as serious as this is, and I think, you know, we have a book that just came out talking about how serious this ideological threat can be to democracy. The good news is there are a lot of Americans who are not ideologically wedded in some kind of ride or die way to either the left or the right.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I would just ask that we do some clarification of the idea of populism and the idea of duress for the non-academics like myself, who are sitting here in the middle of a day trying to wrap their minds around all of this. What would be sort of just a very simple definition of the idea of populism and the idea of duress as you put forth in your book?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm going to do that, but first I want to thank Sam Perry, his co-author, Phil Gorski, and his other co-author for his earlier book, Andrew Whitehead, for being so clear on the difference between evangelicalism as an approach to Protestant faith, which is a theological view of world and the transcendent, and make a distinction between that and a political movement that Sam Perry and his co-authors have so brilliantly researched, called Christian and white Christian nationalism. Politics is the negotiation of power. The alternative to power, as Luke Bretherton is always reminding us, is force. So, and the white Christian nationalist movement, which contains, just as Sam has said, Christians of a wide smattering, some evangelicals, many others as well, and now some secularists as well, is a movement about how power should be distributed in the United States. It's not foundationally a theological doctrine about your relationship with the transcendent or with others, helping the least of these, Christian hospitality, helping the stranger, the poor, the widow, the orphan, the hungry, the thirsty, the prisoner, etc. So Dave has asked me twice to clarify populism and duress. So in my book, White Evangelical Populism, the first thing I had to do was continue a 15, 17-year-long study of reading and researching both evangelicals and populism, and to synthesize the approaches into a working minimal definition. So I'll just go read that again, that it is a response to duress, that, and I'm going to come to duress, that finds its answer to these duresses in an us-them worldview. And that these us-them worldviews draw in complex ways from the history and culture of the place where the populism is located. And that's populism, whether it's in Brazil or Sri Lanka or Poland or Philadelphia. That's populism, a response to duress that finds its solutions to the problem in us-them worldviews, and those worldviews draw from history and culture. What else would they draw from? So what kind of duress are we talking about? Surely economic duress, on and underemployment, a rapidly changing economy, ways to self-betterment are dimming or disappearing, sure, all of that. But also way of life duress, changes in technology you don't get. Hey, I'm 58 and my 28-year-old daughter is making more money than I am on she's some web page designer, I don't know what she's talking about. Technological change. Changes in gender roles, changes in demographics. And the third large area of duress is status loss, the fear that one's place in society is being threatened, that one had a respectable place, not that one was Bill Gates, but one had a respectable place that you felt comfortable, you knew what was going down, you knew what was fair, you knew where you were, and that this is being destabilized. So these three arenas of duress, like any duress, tend to move people emotionally into that us-them shift instead of the usual concern. People are usually concerned about their families, themselves, their own groups, their church group, their golf group, their bowling group, the PTA, their library. They're usually concerned about their own groups. Actually, Sam Perry just said this about all these people who are not mouthing off on social media. People are, concerned about them and theirs. But under duress, we do see this sadly very well documented shift to us-them thinking. Now, instead of being concerned about my group, I'm concerned about my group against another, believed to be the source of the duress. And I wasn't kidding at the end of my intro that this is tragic, because the solutions, us-them solutions, are based on that distortion that duress produces. That duress produces a focus on some other, a scapegoat, often not the source of the original duress. And then you go after the them, and what happens? The original duress, be it economic or status loss of technological or gender roles, that remains. It's unaddressed, and it leaves people with the original duress unrelieved for another round of us-them anger and hatred. And this is, to me, tragic. People choosing solutions to real problems that don't solve the problems.
So I just real briefly, I love the characterization Dr. Pally just kind of put out there. I think that was spot on. Just on that idea of a distortion of my mind goes to a book written in the last couple of years by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson called "Let Them Eat Tweets: How the Right Rules in the Age of Inequality." And I love the title. I was so jealous of it. It's so good. But one of the things they argue for something they call plutocratic populism, which is their observation that white working class, for the Republican Party, for the far right to win politically, they have to mobilize a lot of white working class individuals who often have to vote against their own economic interests to support tax cuts, to support various policies that benefit the wealthy. So how do they do that? Well, they do that by misdirecting misdirecting their anger, their duress, as Dr. Pally said, by saying, hey, it's not, these wealthy people that are getting all these taxes. These are the job creators. This is the American dream. This is what you want. Don't get mad at these folks. Get mad at those immigrants, Muslims, good for nothing, rioters who are, threatening what's yours and taking what's yours, and all these people who are agitating for change. What happened to our country? What happened to our way of life? It's all this cultural upheaval. And so their argument is, this kind of form of populism that is currently working on the right is to take, and white evangelicals are a part of this group. Like they're a part of that group that is being misdirected to direct their populist anger at scapegoats, essentially, rather than thinking about the people who are taking advantage of them for political points.
If I can just piggyback on that for just a second, that there's this wonderful anti-authoritarian, democratic, self-reliant, do-it-yourself ethos that is at the foundational level of America, and it leads to robust civil society and a healthy democratic suspicion of authority and many other wonderful things.
Right.
But under duress, it can be torqued or into this us-them tragic distortions. So the point you made about economics, Sam, if you have very, very wealthy individuals or corporations who don't want government regulation and don't want to pay a lot of taxes, what you want, if you are one of these very wealthy elites, is small government. Now that happens not to benefit, let's say, the public schools or infrastructure, roads and bridges, Wi-Fi for ordinary Americans. But by tapping into that traditional small governmentism that began as healthy anti-authoritarianism, but then becomes not opposition to tyranny and tyrannical government, it becomes opposition to government. And if you can enliven and animate that, you get people who would benefit from reasonable government programs, or government in partnership with business, or federal government in partners with local government and business, who would benefit from such economic structures, voting against them. Susan Mettler, a wonderful sociologist, has documented this in terms of healthcare and social services, that people who need help to pay their healthcare bills and social services will vote against the help they need if they think it's A, coming from the government, or B, going to them. And them is a kind of floater. Whoever you think is causing you harm.
So let me turn a corner for a minute, because this is some great foundational elements and some foundational truths. But I want to turn to the 2016 election. And I want you to very specifically, and as briefly as you can, tie the shifts that were taking place in modern evangelicalism that allowed for a Trump victory and sort of a Trump 4 years. This is not a political discussion. This is not a partisan discussion. This is really just what was happening in the evangelical community that allowed for that shift in what appears to be contrary thought to core biblical elements. So I guess essentially what I'm asking is, what came first? Was there a shift in duress within the evangelical community, or did Trump make way for that to be something that could be a successful platform?
So you're doing chicken and egg, are you?
I'm trying.
Sam, do you want to jump in, or I could do some, you could do some. So why don't you start?
Yeah, sure. I don't know about, I don't know about monumental shifts within evangelicalism, but I do think, from their own words, I think evangelicals, after 2 straight losses to Barack Obama, evangelical identity is increasingly over those periods, right, solidified with Republican partisanship and political conservatism. They were already tracking that way, and it became more so. So there was this slow progression of demographic and religious and racial realignments, partisan-wise. You have the rise of the Tea Party, which was, which didn't define itself within evangelicalism, but was characterized by, a lot of evangelical sentiment, and certainly had its inroads within the Evangelical Party, and there was a lot of overlap with small government ideology and populism and anti-government intervention and those kinds of things. And I think, Trump was so given that desperation of 2 straight losses to the Democratic Party and the idea that this was going to happen again, Hillary Clinton represented Barack Obama, I think for all intents and purposes, was very moderate as a president. I mean, it was not radical, even on things like abortion. He was apologetically, is the best word, apologetically pro-choice. I mean, I remember he went in front of Rick Warren with John McCain. And Rick Warren asks him, when does life begin? And he basically dodges the question and says, like, hey, it's above my pay grade, but let's all agree that we would like fewer abortions. And then he, goes on. That was actually a pretty brilliant answer, because he wasn't able to be characterized as somebody who is just unapologetically pro-choice. Hillary Clinton was unapologetically pro-choice. She talked about the deplorable. She set herself up to really give, as the bad guy in this us versus them populism that Dr. Pally is talking about. Evangelicals and leaders on the right, I think, were able to set Hillary Clinton up as, you thought Barack Obama was bad, just wait till you get a load of what Hillary Clinton is about to do to y'all. And Hillary and so Donald Trump represented, and we actually have data on this. This is so it is false that that evangelicals held their noses and voted for Trump. We actually have data from around 2016, January 2016, well before Trump was the odds-on favorite to get the nomination. We have data that shows, this is, I think, Pew data, that shows that evangelicals who go to church often, it was religious evangelicals were already favoring Trump over Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush and Carson. And the reason why, I think Tony Perkins put it best. We were tired of getting pushed around by Obama and his leftists, and we were glad somebody was on the playground who was willing to punch the bully. That's what Trump represented. Now, that is not taking away, influences of subtle racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia that Trump was able to stoke, but it was this persona of Trump as the guy who will fight for you and take back this country from the elites and the globalists and people, the leftists, who are going to obscure and pervert and twist this country that rightfully belongs to good people like you. So I don't know about radical transitions within evangelicalism, but I know Trump was certainly able to take advantage of the opportunities that were present with the Hillary Clinton candidacy and post 2 straight, successful terms of Obama.
Yeah. So I would, because I'm in cultural studies and cultural history, in the Trump evangelical, and remember, a lot of people who were not evangelical voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but in that question, because my book is looking at this very large block of voters, 25% of all voters. And my research on evangelicals, that's the research I've been doing over the last 17 or so years. It was a long progression, really starting with the late 19th century. And as I quickly ran over, a response to urbanization, industrialization, changing social mores, Darwinism, you saw a move to apocalyptic forms of the faith in the late 19th century, premillenarianism, the Keswick and Holiness movements, Pentecostalism, which you can understand how all of these end-time apocalyptic movements reflected evangelical anxieties about the future in a rapidly changing America. And but it also increased their sense of marginalization and separation from the mainstream. And then you get scopes in 25, and then you get school prayer being unconstitutional in 62. Then you get the 60s, the civil rights movement, all of those outsiders, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, all of those big government programs, which evangelicals were wary of for beginning with ethical reasons at the founding of our country. And then you get the feminist and the gay, the sexual revolution, the feminist movements, the gay rights movements. Throughout the 70s, the evangelical rallying cry was not abortion, but rather the threat of the federal government to take away the tax-exempt status of segregated religious schools. And then when that situation was resolved in the late 1970s, the focus shifted to abortion. Randall Balmer, among others, has documented this down to the letter. And you get an increasing mix of economic duresses through the 80s, 90s, and aughts. We have and very rapidly way of life changes and demographic changes and gender role changes to a group who have learned that wariness of government and wariness of outsiders is part of their ethical stance and self-protection. And I think this took off with the election of our first African-American president, Barack Obama, his increasing the role of big government in social sciences, in social services. And all for this long period, you can see, if you look at the voting behavior as Sam Perry has done, as Dr. Perry has done, that the voting behavior gets more and more committed to the political right by white evangelicals. And
okay, let me pause you there, because I want to capture something that piece of what you just said, which is like you have this very large evangelical voting bloc that has had some losses and some wins along the way. So what I want to know is, where do both of you land on the intersection of politics and faith as it translates to the local church, to the people sitting in the church who identify as evangelicals? What has this last 4 or 5 or 10 years done to those people who are just average Americans sitting in a chair or a pew in a church somewhere? And even more importantly to me, what has that done to those who may not have been a part of the evangelical community or not a part of any religious community? How has this last 4 or 5 or 10 years changed their understanding of the church and its influence in the world?
I'm just going to throw out one thing and then let Dr. Perry pick up. In 2008, most Americans, including white evangelicals, found preaching from the pulpit to be unacceptable. And that is clearly no longer the case. That and Dr. Perry has already
you meant
it.
preaching politics from the pulpit, right? So you just said preaching from the, yeah, that's right.
No, not preaching from the pulpit, preaching politics from the pulpit. Thank you. Sure. Sorry about that. And Dr. Perry has already mentioned the way our partisan politics has kind of sucked up everything else about our lives. So that you could, 30 years ago, you could be an evangelical Democrat and an evangelical Republican. In the middle of the 20th century, before, you could be an evangelical socialist. But our partisan divide now has kind of divided everything. So now we have not only politics from the pulpit, we have partisan politics from the pulpit. And Dr. Perry, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's speaking from a position of, a person of faith myself, and observing these things going on in the church and having to see, churches sort themselves out through the last however many years. It's certainly been a source of a lot of contention and disagreement and angst We now have, I think, what is incontrovertible evidence that politics is in many ways driving religion, and by driving religion, I mean we can show both with survey evidence and with experimental evidence that far right politics is actually driving more Americans away from religion, that they are reacting to what they consider to be the undue influence of religion on politics in a reactionary kind of way. Now, that is not to say people of faith cannot vote their values. That is not to say that people of faith can't be involved in politics and be interested. And I think being interested in politics is a good thing. Local politics, national politics. The problem is our national politics has become like sports, and so we are watching. To say I feel this way about a political candidate is not to say that I'm informed. It's just to say that I hate them like I hate the Patriots and Tom Brady, or something like that, right? It's all of a sudden this kind of a cultural phenomenon that you just kind of like watch people do battle, and it's something that we forget that this is talking about real people with real policy implications. Our identities are swept up into it in the kind of team psychology. But related to that, I think within the church and outside of the church, we are documenting that Americans, young people especially, are reacting to what they perceive to be the wedding of religion and politics. And I can point you to a great book, David Campbell, with some co-authors who co-wrote the book, with Robert Putnam, American Grace. David Campbell has written a book called Secular Surge, and they amass all of this great evidence, and they show that young Americans in particular respond to what I would call Christian nationalism. They call it just the wedding of the infiltration of faith into politics and vice versa. That they are really walking away from church, from religious identity, from something that they might have otherwise embraced, because they are saying, hey, if that's what religion is going to be, then count me out. I don't really want any part of that. I think on the other end of that, you have pressures that evangelical pastors are facing. Pick a side, essentially. We had churches locally in Norman, and I've talked to a bunch of pastors that they had a lot of people after 2020 and around 2020 because of George Floyd, because of Trump. They had people basically leave because if they said anything about race, all of a sudden that means they are into CRT and wokeness, and they're, you guys have gone full woke and we're just going to leave and go to some other thing. So you see this kind of partisan sorting within the church, that you either have to be fully on board with all of these kind of what are perceived to be more progressive options, or you have to go full anti-wokeness, anti-critical race theory, pro-homeschool, anti-masks, suspicions of all this, the full populism, as Dr. Pally was talking about. So, I think this really puts pastors, and you could speak to this more than I could, Dave, but I think this really puts evangelical pastors in a really precarious situation. But I think I would just say I think the reactionary response of evangelical populism within the last 10 years, I think, has compromised the church's witness. And I don't mean witnesses in their faithfulness, but I think it has compromised the church's witness in terms of their national reputation. No longer are they thought of as people who are serving their communities, or loving their neighbor, or sacrificing themselves. In public discourse, they're just religious Trumpsters. And that is a tragedy, I think, because evangelicalism is a lot more complicated and diverse than that.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. It does create this tension, right? And historically, the idea of from the pulpit being political, that being bad, is actually kind of unique to the white church, right? And that is a piece that created a dynamic by which that when it became political, when it became partisan, it became this really massive contrast, and created a real significant issue for pastors and for people sitting in church witnessing this. But in the Black church and Hispanic church, the idea of raising political issues in the context of the pulpit has always been the case. And I think that's why we see Black congregates and Hispanic congregates and Asian congregates pulling away from predominantly white culture churches, because they weren't addressing the political things that were happening, like discrimination and economic disparity and things that are happening along the border and things of that nature that are in the very core actually biblical concepts of love and peace and the ability to care for one's brother. And so it's significant. And so there is a role to be played. I just am not 100% sure what it is today. And that, I think, is the confusing part. And that's actually reflected in several questions that have come up. And so we're scheduled to end in about 18 minutes. So I want to save room about 15 minutes here towards the end for questions. But Dr. Pally, in your book, you talk about this idea of weaker populisms. And I wonder if you could just talk about just the idea of weaker populism, just a little bit, and just elaborate on that just very briefly. And then what role does that play in the conversation that we're now having?
Well, thank you. In fact, you're mentioning the relationship between faith and politics in churches of color is a really good bridge to that question. And of course, in our discussion of white evangelicals has to be distinct and respectful of the very different history and the very different present that the churches by people of color have had. And those require different studies of their own, fortunately, which have been done in other books. So that material, which is absolutely critical, is also out there, thank goodness. Weaker populism. So if their weaker populism might be exemplified by the civil rights movement, Bernie Sanders campaign, the farmers movement in the progressive era in the 1890s. Weaker populism is still a response to duress, and it still finds solution in us, them. But in softer populisms, you have how inclusive is us, or how exclusive. So the more inclusive, the softer the populism. How permanent and binary is the struggle with them? If it's a permanent struggle of good and evil, that's a stronger populism. If it's a struggle about negotiated labor policies, which can be negotiated by people, even if the negotiations are tough, that's a softer populism. How about ambiguities? Can someone be an ally on one area like environmental protection, but you need to have tough negotiation on wages? How comfortable are you with ambiguities and complexities? So the more binary, the more exclusive us, the more permanent and good versus evil the struggle with them is conceptualized. The less ability to handle ambiguities and the less ability to make a distinction between sort of an absolute fight to the death and negotiable policies. That distinguishes strong populism from softer populisms. Softer populisms, in my view, are on a continuum with many, many efforts in a democratic society to handle tough debates and problems. Even when the negotiations are tough and difficult, they are possible in the world of soft populism.
Okay, that's really good, and thank you for that. There's a question that has come up from Brian Carey, and it kind of leads out of that. And so I'm curious, Telos is all about partnerships and crossing lines of distinction and building partnerships in that world. So I'm wondering if in either of your research or study, there are some insights into the places where collaboration and partnership are actually possible, and what are some of the essentials to that?
Well, I'll start, and then Dr. Perry, you jump in. So the last chapter in my book is about white evangelicals, not in the ranks of this strong populism, not in the ranks of this strong populism. And that chapter goes back into the 1960s and 70s and brings it all the way up to the present, where, for example, we had pro-life Evangelicals for Biden, an organization in 2020 started by the granddaughter of Billy Graham, Yerusha Duford, which was bipartisan on the idea that the best way to reduce abortion, which many people of goodwill are unhappy about, is to reduce poverty because of the overwhelming numbers of abortions that are economically motivated. And so on the reasoning that the Biden platform would do more to reduce poverty and therefore reduce abortion, this organization was founded bipartisanly. There are also Christians Against Christian Nationalism is another group that has people of many places on the political continuum working against the kind of hard populism or the hard Christian nationalism that Dr. Perry was just describing. I'll stop there and let Dr. Perry jump in, but because I have a whole chapter on it, and I want to hear what Dr. Perry's research shows.
No, I think we actually have a lot less data on coalition building and the opportunities for cooperation in the current moment. I can speak from my experience primarily. I think I have found myself frequently on the same panel with persons representing Christians Against Christian Nationalism, the Baptist Joint Committee, pastor like Jamar Tisby, and also an atheist lawyer who has worked for the Freedom from Religion Foundation and now for the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Andrew Seidel. And so we have written reports together, we have spoken on committees together, and we are united. Not because we share a common theology, but because we share a common concern over the entrance and advent and radicalization of what we call white Christian nationalism, but I think it's characteristic of this kind of religious populism that Pally is talking about. So there are ample opportunities. I'm thankful for never Trump evangelicals like David French and Russell Moore who are speaking out against Christian nationalism, as I am people on the left, like Chrissy Stroop, who is an evangelical trans activist journalist, and so I think there are opportunities. And we find ourselves really confronted with the question of how big of a threat is this, right? Like how big of a problem is this, and what is it going to take for us to drop real differences, right? Like, and I'm not minimizing those differences that we share, but at the same time, if an asteroid was headed to our planet, I don't think I would look around and start asking, who is pro this or that kind of political issue. I think I would say, hey, this threat is confronting us. We need to drop that and cooperate so that we can do this. Ideally, you would think COVID would have been that asteroid. You just thought that would have been the thing that would cause us to just drop it and unite together. I don't know what it's going to take, but I think so far I have seen cooperation and coalition building across this response to this radicalized white Christian nationalism. And I'd like to see more of that.
I should point out that there was considerable split among white evangelicals, and the question and has been for a while, on immigration and refugee resettlement, where many even white evangelical churches broke with the strong populist right on immigration and said, no, it is our faith that we help the stranger and the refugee, and continued in immigrant and refugee resettlement programs, working, of course, with other faith-based organizations and local social services. An example of excellent partnering, born of the faith in the biblical tenet of aiding the stranger and the needy and the homeless. So that's one. That's one example, and there are many. I mean, I'm thinking of David Gushee and who is an ethicist, evangelical ethicist, who is also just written a new book and is trying to carve out an ethics, an evangelical ethics that people in the pews. His writing is very, very accessible and is meant for everybody, to back away from this strong us-them populism and enable us again to work on solving society's problems rather than, and what I said earlier, going to us-them solutions based on the distortions that the duress and problems themselves prod.
Yeah, I have one last question from Ann Howard, and then we'll have to say goodbye to our folks. But Ann Howard asked this question: can you speak to the us worldview that's also present on the left, and how this interacts with this worldview on the right? So talk a little bit about the us versus them that also exists on the left-hand side of the political spectrum.
It is to my dismay sometimes, that the age-old political wisdom that the radical left and the radical right meet, that seems sometimes to be still true. And I see people from very different political positions digging in a combative us-them way, and they spur each other on, right? They give each other the them to fight.
That's right.
And they give each other the them to enliven and work up people's sentiments. And so the two extremes can play off each other. And very little of this solves society's problems on the issues that are so very serious in our society.
Yeah, so I would just, I'd say that is absolutely confirmed in the data. I was pointing to the book Secular Surge by David Campbell and his colleagues recently. He found that at the end of the religious spectrum, at either end, you've got hardcore, far like religious right, far right kind of populists, and you've got radical secularist populists, and both of them are score very low on the willingness to compromise to do anything, right? Like it's just they'd rather die than just compromise, because that is letting Satan or whoever win, right? Like it's a cosmic battle between good and evil, and to engage in that kind of like deep-seated team psychology where just you would rather just burn the whole thing down to see it go to somebody else is very real and very dangerous. I will say this though, I think I would speak to my more progressive citizens, my more progressive brothers and sisters who feel like, hey, if it's gonna be a fight, let's do this, and we'll just stay polarized. Political scientist, I think he's at Princeton, but Nolan McCarty, who studied political polarization for years with his colleagues, has argued in his little primer on polarization, which is very, very good. He argues that polarization primarily serves, to the extent that it bogs down the government and makes government ineffective, it only serves one group, and that is the right. So to the extent that the left is comfortable leaning into polarization and saying, hey, let's just kind of keep it polarized, you're actually really only serving the group that wants the government to be ineffective, so that it can say, hey, the government sucks. This is really, isn't this horrible? Wouldn't we just rather get rid of all this? If you want healthy institutions that actually accomplish the things that we want it to accomplish, to some degree, you have to be willing to tone down the rhetoric, to compromise with people in order to keep this working. Otherwise, the people who like the populist idea that government is horrible and let's just get rid of it, and actually that it plays into the hands of strongmen as well, because failed states give rise to strongman demagogues. And so, like, if we don't commit to compromises and decisions that allow governments to function well, then I think we play into the strong arm kind of game plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just in the conclusion of my book, that if you want to be free of, let's say, labor safety regulations or consumer safety regulations or environmental protection regulations, if you want small governmentism of the kind that, for example, got us the recession of 2007, 8, and 9, then you want to make government seem dysfunctional. And the more the extremes fight, the less gets done, the more government seems dysfunctional, and then you've won your argument. Just as you say, Dr. Perry, who wants this mess, right? Let's get rid of government.
Exactly.
And that plays into not only the right, but it benefits the very, very wealthy. And unfortunately doesn't benefit some people who would vote for that opinion for the reasons we've discussed here today, for the belief system reasons, but actually doesn't address the problems that the vast majority of Americans face. The famous bread and butter issues, which are not cliched, but the way we live.
Well, this is all really good content. And I'm really grateful for both of your work. I'm grateful for the books. If you have come along in the middle of this conversation, the links to both of these two professors' books are in the chat. As we close, I just want to comment on the fact that, this idea of zero sum, this idea of battle to the end and fight to the end really is representative, as you said in the very beginning, of a small number of very loud folks on each end of that spectrum. And there is a lot of people in the very middle who can be engaged, can be brought into the conversation through the idea of peacemaking, through the idea of building bridges. And that is what Telos does. That is what other organizations that we partner with, like Arabon and groups like that, who all around the world are there to reach those folks in the middle, to build these bridgeways, these bridges to fight conflict, or to push against the oppression that might exist even in the political and in the religious sphere. And so that is really, that for me, at the end of the day, all of this research is phenomenal. All of this content is phenomenal. At the end of the day, it is the individual's responsibility to find a way to make peace, to find a way to build a bridge towards the other in their community, or the neighbor in their backyard. And hopefully this information that we've been given, the statistics and the compelling arguments that we've been given here today, help fuel that drive for that. So I want to thank both our experts, Dr. Pally and Dr. Perry, for being present with us today. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, for giving us a part of your day today as Telos seeks to continue to build bridges in all kinds of conflict and across different aisles around the world. So thank you so much, everybody, for being a part. Thank you to both of the doctors and for everyone else for being with us. You all have a great day.
Thank you, Dave, for being a wonderful moderator. Thanks to everybody. Thanks, Sam, and thanks to everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.